Thank you for joining me, Senator, and congratulations on being incoming chair of the Finance Committee. I'm going to have some questions for you on what that will look like going ahead. Just to start things off broadly, what are some of your priorities in that position?
Well, first of all, Adam, there's some big news just in the last few hours. The Senate Republicans, 10 of them, have presented a package to our new president with respect to economic relief. And the first thing I want to tell those who are following this is that package that's presented by the 10 Senate Republicans is far too small to provide the relief that the American people need. In particular, I think this idea that with millions of people hurting and unemployed, there is a 3-month extension of jobless benefits. That is a non-starter. I've indicated to Senate Republicans, I am willing to talk about these issues, ways in which you can target benefits and things of this nature that reasonable people can find common ground on. But I want it understood that as we examine this package, which is really just a fraction of what the president believes needs to be done for folks who are counting on those vaccinations and help for the unemployed, state and local assistance, and then of course those $2,000 checks. What the Republicans, the 10 of them today offered, I think is just a non-starter.
Well, we're definitely going to be closely following that and see whether that comes to pass. Do you think that given the senators coming up to you with this non-starter, do you think it'll be necessary to go to the reconciliation process?
Well, I continue to hold out hope that Senate Republicans will offer a proposal where there can be real discussions. For example, the significant disappointment with what the 10 have offered is it's not even in the ballpark. We have an enormous need with respect to vaccinations because cases are spiking. When the cases spike, of course, we also see significant problems with rising, unemployment. We've had projections that in terms of getting back to where we were pre-pandemic, it is going to be months and months and months before anything like that happens. And then a number of our state and local governmental entities who need the funds, for example, for matters that relate to emergency medical. They too are in very serious straits. And to have this offer here at the last minute that really isn't even in the ballpark, I think it's just very unfortunate. We'll continue to listen, but I've made it clear with respect to my comments to Senate Republicans. I'll always work to find common ground. That's pretty much in my DNA. Mm-hmm. But if Senate Republicans are stalling for the sole purpose of stalling, then we've got to go ahead and act to meet these urgent needs.
Mm. So you obviously have a full plate of stuff moving forward. Just to go back to, you have a number of investigations that are still open into the Trump era. And when we first spoke to each other, Senator, you had just opened or recently opened the investigation into Turkey's state-run Halk Bank. What's the future of that investigation now that the Biden era has begun?
Well, we do have a number of investigations still open. Turkey and Halk Bank, money laundering, opportunity zones, syndicated conservation easements, Jared Kushner and Qatar, and the politicization of FinCEN. So suffice it to say, apropos something that you have really done trailblazing work on with respect to our relationship with Turkey, we know that Donald Trump has significant financial interests in Turkey. With Trump Tower Istanbul, we know that he and his family have built personal relationships with Turkish officials. And suffice it to say, Erdogan is still there. So we are going to be continuing our inquiry and following the pardon of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in December. I drove deeper into what Trump and his associates have been doing with respect to critics. So we've got a lot to do.
Right. And with the, in particular, with Halkbank being a money laundering scheme, the Senate just passed in the military appropriations bill, essentially abolishing anonymous shell companies. Is that going to make your work easier as you drill into these investigations?
As you know, I offered a bipartisan bill and spent considerable time and effort pushing for that legislation. The bill requires that beneficial ownership be reported to Treasury when the company is created, because in the past you would have to just go through paper after paper after paper, or just reams of traditional kinds of documents to try to figure out where the beneficial ownership really was. And life didn't get much easier online either. So we want to get to the bottom of this. And bad actors have long used shell companies to facilitate a range of crimes, from drug trafficking to sanctions evasion. I discussed this with our new Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, at our private meeting, and she assured me that this would be a priority to implement this. And if we're really going to get to the bottom of some of these corrupt acts, and I describe them that way, we've got to make sure that there's transparency. And that's what our beneficial ownership reforms have been all about.
Mm. You mentioned your Jared Kushner investigation. There was how cooperative, if at all, have Brookfield Properties, the one that bought Kushner's 666 Fifth Avenue property, and the former White House, outgoing White House, been in that investigation? And do you expect it to turn the corner now that you're in charge?
I don't think that cooperation with investigations is how I would characterize it. I would characterize it as stonewalling at every opportunity. So we are going to continue to try to get to the bottom of this, because, as I say, a lot of the financial interests are still there. Erdogan is still there. I know that a young basketball player in Oregon, Enes Kanter, continues to be troubled by Erdogan and his practices, his authoritarian practices. So these issues are continuing.
Mm. And you've worked very hard also to get some transparency in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. When do you think we might get to see the CIA report?
I'm very hopeful that will be a matter of weeks. The new director of national intelligence responded to my question, because I authored the law that required that the government release the information they had with respect to who killed Jamal Khashoggi, and publish, as my law required, a non-classified report. She said at an open intelligence hearing here right at the beginning of this Congress that she would comply. I'm counting on it being a matter of weeks.
Excellent. And in terms of the, if I can just switch gears entirely, during the Capitol insurrection, can you tell me what it was like being in the U.S. Capitol? What were your experiences on that day?
I felt, as this horror unfolded, that it was domestic terrorism. If you look up in your dictionary, what domestic terrorism is really all about is people who would use intimidation to achieve a political end. And that is how I would describe what went on that day. And to see, for example, courageous Capitol officials, military officials, guarding the Senate that way, it just made you realize just how ominous a development like this can be. So even before I assumed the position of chair of the Senate Finance Committee, which hasn't actually gone forward officially yet, I asked the Internal Revenue Service to examine any and all connections between various charitable groups and those that were involved in those horrendous acts that way. I also thought a bit about my family. My parents fled the Nazis in the 30s, not all got out. And my dad talked his way into the army so that he could write propaganda pamphlets that we dropped on the Nazis. And I tried to imagine what he would think about something like this. And to me, there was no question in my mind that there was an effort to incite what took place.
And that's what the Senate trial is all about coming up. I want to talk about your parents' experience fleeing the Nazi regime and coming to the United States. Do you think that they could have ever imagined a day would have come when neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and all these other groups that we've seen in the Capitol insurrection would have invaded the US Capitol, and that someone who spreads anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like Marjorie Taylor Greene would be a member of the US Congress?
Adam, I don't think my parents could have imagined January 6th, but instead of looking back several decades, let's talk about what the world thought on January 6th. I believe what people around the world thought. They just couldn't imagine this happening in the United States. Many of them, I believe, would say, tragically, we wouldn't be surprised if it happened in our country X, Y, or Z. But I think what is the ultimate indictment is millions of people around the world looking at what happened on January 6th would say, I never thought something like that would happen in the United States. And they can't believe that we would consider that something that we would say, it's come and it's gone, and that's the end.
And your father was an investigative journalist. Do you think that that is sort of an inspiration for you in terms of your tendency to look into probing investigations? You know, when this happened, you joined two investigations, the one you mentioned with charities and another one looking into your colleagues, Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. Is your impulse to investigate the past like that one of the things that you take from your investigative journalist father?
I'm very proud of my dad. There's a book not far from where I'm sitting, The Bay of Pigs, The Untold Story. There's a picture of my dad and Fidel Castro on it. And Castro says, Peter Wyden knows more about it than we do. And my dad always said, Ron, you just got to remember to ask the tough questions. Don't be unfair. Just ask the questions that people might take a pass on or be reluctant to ask, because you need to get all the facts. And I think some of that's rubbed off on me.
There are a lot of people, particularly on the Republican side, who, even though this horrific event just happened on January 6th, they're already saying, turn the corner, the election's over. How do you respond to those people? And what would you say to those on the Democratic side who might be pressured to look the other way?
I would say, much as I did in my comments with how the world looks at this, how Do you want this time to be remembered? Do you want this to be a time when domestic terrorists stormed the Capitol, law enforcement officials died, and there were no consequences? That everyone just said, that's the way it is, and moved on? Because when you serve in the United States Senate, and over time it's in the small numbers, you have a responsibility to make events like January 6th, which people are going to remember. You've got a responsibility to make sure that on our watch during this unique time in history, we really want to make clear what we thought of those horrendous acts. And to just say that's in the past, moved on, I think is wrong.
I want to point out another time when you really pushed for people to take a hard look at the past, and it was in 2009. President-elect Barack Obama was about to go into office, and he wanted to turn the page from the Bush era, and particularly in the national security state. And he said that, made the comment that he wanted to do this ambitious agenda to turn that corner there. But he also said, when asked about criminal prosecution, that he wanted to look forward rather than backward. And you said at the time, to make a break with the past, that you have to come clean about what happened over the past 8 years. And you're going to work hard to make sure that declassifying everything and making it come to light. And 5 years later, out came the torture report. What right now do you want to make sure doesn't slip through the memory hole? What investigations are important to you that that you want the Biden administration to pay attention to?
Well, first, with respect to this, torture issue, again, there have been more recent events which I found very troubling. As you know, there's been quite a bit of discussion about Gina Haspel, who, of course, was central to this whole debate for a number of years. And for her confirmation hearing, she basically decided what documents should be declassified about herself. So when you look at events, you have an obligation to push for transparency and accountability. That's always been my watchword, whether it was the tobacco hearings in the House, when the tobacco executives lied to me and the American people and said cancer wasn't addictive. It was the case when we were told in the Senate Intelligence Committee that the government didn't collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans. And it continues to be my kind of lodestar on issue after issue. For example, I was very troubled when the whistleblower protection amendments were dropped from the intelligence authorization. I'm not going to let that happen again. So it's really about transparency and accountability.
And do you think that the fact that the Trump era ended in this horrific incident has brought more people to the conclusion that looking forward, not looking backward, that you need to do both, that the two are intertwined?
Oh, yes. I think that, as I've said in connection to the reviews of January 6th, to bring people together, to have unity, requires accountability.
In terms of, can you go a little bit more into the investigation into Jared Kushner? You announced that very recently. It was during the lame duck session. What made you decide to take up that probe?
Well, it raises some very important potential conflicts. Jared Kushner, of course, continues to try to be an influence, both domestically and internationally. And there should be some real accountability. And we'll have some more to say about it before long.
In terms of the investigation into Jamal Khashoggi, have you been in touch with his fiance recently? What's the mood in terms of how people are feeling about the prospects of accountability there?
I believe that there's a real sense of relief that an administration that basically tried to skip the law. They tried to pretend the law that I wrote didn't really exist. They kept trying to come up with excuse after excuse for not to comply. I think when the new head of national intelligence at her confirmation hearing gave a specific answer to whether or not she and the Biden administration would comply, and she definitively said yes. I think there was a sense of relief, there was a sense of hope, and a feeling that had been absent for years that justice would be done.
Mm. And can you go into the ripples of these investigations that you have into the Trump era? Obviously, it goes beyond Trump, but with the Jamal Khashoggi case, this is talking about their press freedom issues involved. With Hulk Bank, there are issues of a shadow economy and national security. So, to critics who would say that these investigations, why look into the former president? What would you tell them about the broader issues involved?
Well, first of all, I would say that Trump's relationship with some of these authoritarians need to be remembered because they also telegraph what people like Erdogan might be willing to do in the future if they have the opportunity. So this notion that, well, it's all past, the end. Erdogan is still there. We know that Erdogan, like Donald Trump, has consistently looked to try to maximize advantages for himself, whether it's financial or political power and the like. And those are national security interests to the United States as well.
Is there, other than COVID relief, going back to some of your priorities moving forward as chair of the Finance Committee, you have your old investigations that are still underway, and the COVID relief. What are some of your other priorities on your agenda?
One of my top priorities is dealing with a very rigged tax code that, to a great extent, I describe this way. If you're a nurse in America who's treating COVID patients, you pay taxes with every single paycheck, every single one, right there on every check. If you're a billionaire and you have good lawyers and accountants and the like, with respect to your taxes, you don't have to pay every check. In fact, you can just defer and defer and defer. And to a great extent, the tax code is optional for that billionaire who makes their money on investments, and is mandatory for that nurse who gets their paycheck doing hard labor for COVID patients. I want to end that.
And before you were ranking member of the Finance Committee. Now you're the chair. The Democrats are in charge. How does that make your job easier on these investigations? How does your new power as chair of this committee help advance some of these things you are looking into, and presumably an administration that isn't fighting you all the way on them?
Well, you get the bully pulpit and you get to set the agenda. In other words, when you walk into the hearing room on a day that the hearing is set, you know that you'll have the chance to frame an inquiry, to frame the debate. And the difference between trying to find opportunities when someone else is setting the agenda and being able to walk into a hearing room and you setting the agenda with respect to, say, this question of tax fairness that I just described to you. It's an opportunity to, again, lay out the facts and really work in a much more expansive way to build support for your ideas, both in the Congress and in the country.
Thank you very much, Senator.